When the fire engulfed the chemistry lab, the alarms failed, but Frank Sullivan didn't. The janitor everyone mocked became the only person who could save them. While students panicked and teachers froze, Frank ran straight into the flames. What they didn't know was that this quiet janitor had faced fires before and lost everything. But today, Frank wasn't just cleaning up their messes, he was fighting to save their lives. When the graffiti showed up on the school wall, Frank Sullivan just sighed. Bright red letters spelled out "Loser Janitor," dripping down the pale tiles. He grabbed his mop and bucket and got to work cleaning it off. The hallway was quiet, but Frank wasn't alone for long. "Hey, Sullivan," someone called. Frank turned to see Chad and Trevor, two of the school's biggest troublemakers, leaning against the lockers. They were grinning like they'd just won a game. "You missed a spot," Trevor said, pointing at the wall. Frank stayed calm. He dipped his mop back into the bucket without saying a word. "Come on, don't you have anything to say?" Chad teased, stepping closer. "Nope," Frank said simply, his voice steady. When the two boys laughed and walked off, Mia appeared around the corner. She frowned when she saw the graffiti and then glared at the two boys as they disappeared. "Why didn't you stand up to them?" she asked, stepping closer to Frank. Frank wrung out the mop, giving her a small smile. "And do what?" "Argue with them. It's not worth it." "But they shouldn't get away with this," Mia said, crossing her arms. Frank paused and looked at her. His eyes softened, but there was something tired behind them, like he'd seen worse things in his life. "You've dealt with worse, haven't you?" Mia asked quietly. Frank nodded, his hands gripping the mop handle. "Yeah, you could say that." When the bell rang, students poured into the hallway. Mia had to go, but she glanced back at Frank one more time before disappearing into the crowd. Even as she hurried to class, one thought stuck in her mind. Who was Frank Sullivan, really? And what was he hiding? When students saw the graffiti was gone by lunchtime, the whispering started. Some wondered why Frank, the janitor everyone teased, hadn't said anything about it. Others laughed, saying he was probably too scared to fight back. Chad and Trevor, sitting by the window in the cafeteria, smirked at their handiwork. "Bet he spent all morning scrubbing it off," Chad said, biting into a sandwich. "Loser probably thanked us for the extra work." Trevor chuckled but glanced at Mia sitting a few tables away. She was staring at them, her eyes sharp with anger. "She's giving us that look again," Trevor muttered. "Let her," Chad said, leaning back. "What's she gonna do? Write about it in the school paper?" At Mia's table, her friends were trying to change the subject, but she couldn't let it go. "He doesn't deserve this," she said, her voice low but firm. "Why do you care so much?" her best friend Lila asked, poking at her salad. "He's just the janitor." Mia frowned. "He's not just anything. He's kind, and he's always helping people. And I think there's more to him than we realize." Lila raised an eyebrow. "Like what? You think he's some kind of secret superhero?" "I don't know," Mia said, her tone serious, "but I'm going to find out." When the final bell rang, Mia waited by the janitor's closet. She peeked around the corner as Frank pushed his cart of cleaning supplies into the room. "Need something?" he asked without turning around. Mia jumped, embarrassed she'd been caught spying. She stepped into the doorway. "I just wanted to say thanks for putting up with all the crap people give you." Frank looked at her, surprised, and then nodded. "You don't need to thank me for doing my job." "It's not about the job," Mia said quickly. "It's about how you're still nice to everyone, even when they're horrible to you. I don't get how you stay so calm." Frank leaned on the mop handle, thinking for a moment. "Let's just say I've learned what's worth fighting for and what isn't." "Like those guys?" Mia asked. "You let them win every time." Frank's lips curved into a small smile, but his eyes were serious. "Kid, just because I don't fight back doesn't mean they're winning." Mia wanted to ask more, but before she could, Chad and Trevor's loud voices echoed down the hall. They were walking straight toward them, their laughter bouncing off the walls. Frank's shoulders tensed slightly when he heard them, but he didn't move. He nodded to Mia. "You should head home. School's over." "What about you?" she asked. "I've got work to do," he said simply, pushing his cart out of the closet and into the hallway. When Chad and Trevor spotted Frank, their laughter grew louder. "Look who's here," Chad said, stepping in front of the cart. "The janitor's still cleaning up after us. Hey, maybe we should leave another art project for you." Trevor snickered. "You'd like that, wouldn't you, Sullivan?" Frank didn't stop. He moved the cart around them, ignoring their jeers. "Hey," Chad barked, shoving the mop handle so it clattered to the floor. "I'm talking to you." Mia, still watching from the corner, felt her stomach twist. She was about to step forward when Frank finally stopped. When he looked at Chad, his expression was calm, but there was something in his eyes that made the bully take a small step back. "Do you boys need something?" Frank asked quietly, his voice steady. For a moment, neither Chad nor Trevor spoke. There was something about the way Frank stood there, completely unbothered, that made them hesitate. "Yeah, we need you to quit acting like you're better than us," Chad snapped, trying to sound tough. Frank raised an eyebrow. "If that's all, I'll get back to work." Before they could say another word, Frank bent down, picked up the mop handle, and walked away. When the bullies finally left, Mia ran to catch up with Frank. "Why didn't you do something?" she asked, frustrated. Frank gave her a tired smile. "What would you have me do? Fight them? Yell? What good would that do?" "It's not fair," Mia said. "They think they can treat you however they want." "They can think whatever they want," Frank said. "But what matters is what I think, and how I act. You'll understand that someday." Mia stared after him as he walked down the hallway, pushing his cart. She couldn't explain it, but something about his words made her even more determined to uncover the truth about Frank Sullivan. Because one thing was clear, he wasn't just a janitor. When the storm rolled in that evening, the sky turned an angry shade of gray, and the wind howled through the streets like a warning. Frank Sullivan was still at the school, locking up after cleaning the cafeteria. The rain began to pour as he stepped into the parking lot, his old truck parked at the far end. He pulled his hood over his head and began walking when he heard something. A faint cry carried on the wind. Frank stopped, listening. The sound came again, sharper this time. It was coming from the playground behind the school. "Help! Someone!" Frank broke into a jog, his boots splashing in the puddles. When he reached the playground, he saw a small figure clinging to the monkey bars. A boy, maybe 7 or 8, was stuck, his leg caught between the bars, and the rising water was already pooling beneath him. "Hold on, kid!" Frank shouted, his voice cutting through the storm. He climbed onto the structure with practiced ease, reaching the boy in seconds. "It hurts," the boy sobbed, tears mixing with the rain. "I know," Frank said, his voice calm and steady. "But I'm going to get you out of here, okay?" When Frank gripped the bars, his strong hands made quick work of freeing the boy's leg. He scooped him up in one motion and climbed down carefully, shielding the child from the worst of the rain. "You're safe now," Frank said, his tone reassuring. The boy clung to him, still crying, as Frank carried him to the school entrance where it was dry. "What were you doing out here?" I got lost," the boy stammered. "I was trying to go home, and then the storm started and—" Frank knelt down, keeping the boy at eye level. "What's your name?" "Eli," the boy whispered. "Well, Eli, let's call someone to take you home," Frank said. When news of Frank's rescue spread, it wasn't long before students and teachers started talking. Mia heard about it first thing in the morning, sitting in her English class. "Did you hear about the janitor?" one girl whispered to another. "He saved a kid from drowning in the storm last night." "Seriously?" her friend replied. "I thought he just cleaned floors." Mia felt a spark of curiosity. She knew there was something different about Frank. And now, more than ever, she wanted to find out what it was. When Mia saw Frank sitting alone in the cafeteria, eating a sandwich at one of the back tables, she walked over. "Hey," she said, setting her tray down across from him. Frank glanced up, surprised. Something wrong? No, I just wanted to say thanks for what you did last night. Everyone's talking about it. Frank shrugged. It was nothing, just doing what needed to be done. Mia leaned forward, lowering her voice. You know, you're not really fooling anyone. There's no way a regular janitor could handle all the stuff you do. Frank sighed, setting down his sandwich. Mia, it's just a job, nothing more. But that's not true, is it? She pressed. You're not like the other staff. You're different. When Frank didn't answer, she continued. I think you've got a story you're not telling anyone, and I think it's important. Frank's eyes darkened and his expression turned serious. Everyone's got a story, kid. That doesn't mean it needs to be told. But yours does, Mia insisted. Before Frank could respond, Principal Hawkins walked into the cafeteria, his face stern. Sullivan, a word, please. Frank stood, nodding to Mia. Duty calls. When Frank stepped into the office, Principal Hawkins was pacing behind his desk. I heard about last night, Hawkins said. Everything turned out fine, Frank replied, crossing his arms. That's not the point, Hawkins said sharply. You put yourself at risk. Liability is a serious issue for the school. Frank raised an eyebrow. Would you have preferred I let the kid drown? Hawkins froze, then sighed. No, of course not. He rubbed his temples, frustration evident. Why didn't you call 911 and wait for help? Frank's jaw tightened. Because sometimes waiting isn't an option. For a moment, the two men stared at each other, the tension thick in the air. Finally, Hawkins relented. Just, be careful, Sullivan. I can't afford any trouble here. You won't have any, Frank said simply, turning to leave. When the fire alarm didn't go off during fourth period, chaos erupted in the hallways. Smoke poured out of the chemistry lab, filling the air with the acrid stench of burning chemicals. Students screamed, teachers shouted over each other, and the building felt like it was spinning out of control. Frank Sullivan was mopping the gym floor when he smelled it, sharp and unmistakable. His head snapped up, and he dropped the mop without a second thought. Rushing toward the source, he passed panicked students and teachers fumbling for answers. Where's the alarm? Someone yelled. It's not working, another voice cried. Frank's pulse quickened. He hadn't smelled a fire like this since. He shook off the memory and focused. When he reached the chemistry lab, the smoke was thick and black. A group of students huddled near the door, coughing and frightened. Is anyone still inside? Frank asked sharply. I think so, one of the students choked out. Without hesitation, Frank grabbed a fire extinguisher off the wall and covered his face with his sleeve. Get to the main doors, he ordered. Don't stop for anything. When Frank entered the lab, the heat hit him like a wall. Flames licked at the countertops and broken glass littered the floor. He spotted a girl crouched under a table, clutching her knees, frozen in fear. It's okay, Frank called out, his voice steady. I'm here to help you. The girl looked up, tears streaming down her soot-covered face. I can't move, she stammered. Frank moved swiftly, keeping low. When he reached her, he crouched down and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. You're going to be fine, he said, his voice calm and confident. Just hold on to me. With surprising ease, he lifted her and began navigating back through the smoke. His breaths were measured, every step calculated, as memories of past fires flashed in his mind. When he reached the hallway, students and teachers gasped at the sight of him emerging from the smoke, the girl in his arms. Call 911, Frank barked at a nearby teacher. This isn't over. When Frank set the girl down and made sure she was safe, he overheard a frantic voice from the gym. Help! They're trapped! Frank's stomach dropped. Without stopping to rest, he sprinted toward the sound. Inside the gym, Chad and Trevor were banging on the door of the storage closet, shouting for help. The fire had spread faster than anyone expected, and thick smoke was seeping under the door. Frank didn't hesitate. "Step back!" he yelled. He grabbed a nearby bench and used it to ram the closet door, the wood splintering on impact. After the third hit, the door gave way, and Chad and Trevor stumbled out, coughing and disoriented. Frank pulled them toward the nearest exit, his grip firm despite their protests. "You're gonna be fine," Frank said as they reached fresh air. Chad wheezed, glancing at Frank with wide eyes. You saved us." Frank gave a short nod, then turned back toward the school without another word. When the fire trucks finally pulled into the school's lot, Frank was still inside, making sure no one was left behind. A firefighter in full gear spotted him as he emerged from the building for the last time, coughing and covered in soot. "Frank," the firefighter called out, pulling off his helmet. Frank froze. "Harper?" Detective Harper, Frank's former colleague, stared at him in shock. "What are you doing here?" Frank didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward the students gathering in the parking lot. They needed help. Harper's eyes narrowed as he put the pieces together. "You haven't changed a bit," he muttered, shaking his head. When the chaos finally settled, Frank stood quietly near the edge of the parking lot, watching the firefighters finish their work. Students and teachers whispered as they glanced at him, their expressions a mix of awe and confusion. Mia approached, her face pale but determined. "You went back in there. You saved everyone," she said. Frank shrugged. "It's what anyone would have done." "No, it's not," Mia argued. "Most people would have run." Frank didn't respond, but Mia wasn't done. "You were incredible in there. Why are you hiding it? Why don't you want people to know who you are?" Before Frank could answer, Harper appeared beside him. "Because he doesn't think he's a hero," Harper said, his tone pointed. Mia looked between them, confused. "What do you mean?" Frank shook his head. "That's enough, Harper." But Harper wasn't backing down. "You saved lives today, Frank. Just like you always did. It's time people knew the truth." Mia's eyes widened. "What truth?" Frank sighed, running a hand through his soot-streaked hair. "Not now, kid. Go home." As Mia reluctantly walked away, Harper crossed his arms. "You can't keep running from it, Frank. They deserve to know the kind of man you really are." Frank didn't reply. He just watched the smoke billowing from the school, his face unreadable. When the students returned to school the next day, the hallway buzzed with whispers about Frank Sullivan. Word of his heroics had spread fast, and even Principal Hawkins couldn't avoid acknowledging it. During the morning announcements, Hawkins cleared his throat awkwardly. "Before we begin, I'd like to recognize a member of our staff. Yesterday, Frank Sullivan, our janitor, acted with bravery and quick thinking during the fire. His actions saved multiple lives. On behalf of the school, thank you, Mr. Sullivan." Frank, standing in the back of the cafeteria with a mop in hand, looked down, his face blank. The students broke into applause, and Mia's voice rang out above the rest. "That's right. Frank's a hero." Chad and Trevor sat at their table, silent for once. Chad stared at the floor while Trevor fidgeted with his lunch tray. When the lunch bell rang, Mia found Frank mopping near the lockers. "Hey, can we talk?" she asked. Frank didn't stop working. "What's on your mind?" "I think there's more to you than you're letting on," Mia said. "You didn't just act fast yesterday. You knew exactly what to do, like you've done it before." Frank kept mopping, but his grip on the handle tightened. "I'm just a janitor, Mia. That's all there is to it." "That's not true," she said firmly. "Detective Harper knew you. He said you've saved lives before. So, what's your story, Frank? Why are you here?" Frank set the mop aside, sighing. He leaned against the wall, his eyes distant. "Some stories don't need telling," he said quietly. "But this one does," Mia insisted. "People look up to you. They deserve to know the truth. I deserve to know." Frank's gaze met hers, and for a moment Mia thought he might open up. But then the distant look returned, and he shook his head. "Go to class, Mia." When Chad and Trevor walked into detention later that afternoon, the tension between them was heavy. Trevor finally broke the silence. He saved us, you know. After everything we did to him, he still came back for us. Chad nodded, staring at the desk. Yeah, I don't get it. Why would he do that? Maybe he's just better than us, Trevor muttered. Chad frowned. We should say something to him. Like what? Sorry for being jerks. That won't fix anything. Maybe not, Chad admitted, but it's a start. When Harper visited Principal Hawkins later that day, he brought with him a file that made the principal's eyebrows shoot up. Frank Sullivan was a firefighter? Hawkins asked, flipping through the pages. Not just any firefighter, Harper said. He was a lieutenant, one of the best I ever worked with, saved more people than I can count. Then why is he here, mopping floors? Harper hesitated. Because of what happened 2 years ago. He lost a team member in a building collapse. Blamed himself for it even though it wasn't his fault. He quit the department and disappeared. Took this job to stay under the radar. Hawkins closed the file and leaned back in his chair. I had no idea. Most people don't, Harper said. But you saw what he did yesterday. Frank doesn't need the recognition, but the kids in this school need someone like him. Someone to look up to. Hawkins nodded slowly. You're right. The question is, how do we help him see that? When Frank stepped into the cafeteria to clean up after lunch, Chad and Trevor were waiting for him. Hey, Sullivan, Chad said, his voice quieter than usual. Frank glanced at him but didn't stop moving. What do you need? Trevor scratched the back of his neck, looking uncomfortable. We, wanted to say sorry. For everything. Frank paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. Sorry? Yeah, Chad said quickly. We were wrong to mess with you. And after what you did yesterday, we feel like jerks. Frank studied them for a moment before nodding. Good. Feeling like a jerk means you're starting to figure things out. Chad blinked, surprised by the response. You're not mad? Frank shook his head. Life's too short for grudges. Just do better. Trevor let out a nervous laugh. Yeah, we'll try. When Mia saw Harper leaving the school later that day, she ran to catch him. Detective Harper, she called. He stopped, turning to face her. You're Mia, right? Frank mentioned you. Sort of, she said, catching her breath. I just want to know the truth about Frank. I think he's amazing, but he won't talk to me. Harper chuckled. That sounds like Frank. Please, Mia pressed. If I understood what he's been through, maybe I could help him. Harper studied her for a moment, then sighed. All right, but if I tell you, you've got to promise me something. You won't push him too hard. He's been through enough. I promise, Mia said, her heart racing. Harper nodded. Frank was a firefighter for 20 years, a decorated hero. But 2 years ago, during a rescue, a building collapsed. One of his men didn't make it. Frank blamed himself and left the department. He's been hiding ever since. Mia's chest tightened. But it wasn't his fault? No, Harper said firmly. It wasn't. But try telling him that. When Mia walked home that evening, her mind was spinning. Frank Sullivan wasn't just a janitor. He was a hero hiding in plain sight, carrying the weight of a tragedy that wasn't his fault. She made a silent vow to help him see himself the way she, and now the whole school, saw him, as a true hero. When Frank arrived at the school the next morning, he noticed something unusual. Students were gathered near the entrance, huddled around what looked like a large banner. He approached cautiously, his old boots crunching against the gravel. The banner was stretched across the wall where the graffiti had once been. It read, "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan, our hero." Below it were dozens of handprints in colorful paint, each one signed by a student or teacher. Frank stopped, his breath catching. Mia appeared from the crowd, her face beaming. "Do you like it?" she asked. Frank looked at her, unsure of what to say. "You didn't have to do this." "We wanted to," Mia said. "You deserve it." Frank's jaw tightened and he shook his head. "I'm just doing my job, Mia. I'm no hero." Mia's smile faded. "That's not true, and you know it." Before Frank could respond, Principal Hawkins appeared beside him. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, his voice firm but kind, "you've inspired this school in ways I never expected. I think it's time we talked about your story." Frank's face darkened. "There's no story to tell." "Yes, there is," Hawkins insisted, "and it's one this school needs to hear." When Frank entered the janitor's closet to escape the attention, he sat down heavily on a stool. His hands trembled as memories he'd tried to bury came rushing back. He was back at the scene of the fire 2 years ago, the building engulfed in flames, the weight of his gear pressing down on him. He could still hear the panicked voices on the radio, the crackle of the fire, and the gut-wrenching sound of the roof caving in. "Lieutenant Sullivan, get out of there." But he hadn't. He'd stayed behind, trying to save the last man trapped inside, and when the collapse came, it took everything from him. Frank ran a hand over his face, forcing the memory back into the depths of his mind. The janitor's closet was small and quiet, a far cry from the chaos of his past. When Mia overheard students talking about how Frank had gone quiet after the banner, she knew something was wrong. She waited until the hallways were clear, then knocked softly on the door to the janitor's closet. "Come in," Frank called, his voice weary. Mia stepped inside, the small space feeling even smaller with her presence. "You okay?" she asked. Frank nodded, but his eyes stayed on the floor. "People want to celebrate you," Mia said gently. "Why can't you let them?" Frank sighed. "Because they don't know the whole story. They don't know that sometimes, no matter how hard you try, you can't save everyone." Mia's heart ached at the pain in his voice. "But you saved so many people. You've done so much good." Frank looked up at her, his eyes filled with a sadness that felt bottomless. "It's the ones you can't save that stay with you." When Harper showed up at the school later that day, Frank was reluctant to see him. "What are you doing here?" Frank asked as the two men stood near the back entrance. "Checking on you," Harper said, "and making sure you're not hiding from the world again." Frank frowned. "I'm not hiding. I'm working." "Working to avoid dealing with the past," Harper countered. Frank didn't respond, but Harper pressed on. "The fire yesterday, the kids you saved, it's proof that you're still the same guy I worked with, the guy who doesn't back down when things get tough." "I'm not that guy anymore," Frank said quietly. Harper shook his head. "You keep telling yourself that, but everyone else sees it. The kids, the teachers, even the principal. You're not invisible, Frank. You never were." When Frank left work that evening, he found Mia waiting for him outside. She was holding a stack of papers. "What's this?" he asked. "Research," she said, "about the fire 2 years ago. I know you don't like to talk about it, but I read about what happened. It wasn't your fault, Frank." Frank's jaw tightened. "You shouldn't have looked into that." "I had to," Mia said firmly. "You can't keep blaming yourself for something you couldn't control." Frank's hands clenched into fists. "You think reading a few articles means you understand? You weren't there, Mia. You don't know what it's like to lose someone and feel like it's on you." Mia stepped closer, her voice softening. "You're right. I don't know what that's like, but I know what it's like to look up to someone who doesn't see how incredible they are, and I know you've spent too long punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault." Frank stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. When Mia handed him the papers, Frank hesitated before taking them. "You don't have to carry this alone," she said. "Let us help you." Frank watched her walk away, the stack of papers in his hands. For the first time in years, he felt something stir within him, a flicker of hope buried under years of guilt and regret. He looked down at the papers and sighed. Maybe it was time to stop running. When Frank arrived at school the next morning, the banner was still hanging, but this time no students crowded around it. Instead, they were gathered in the auditorium for a special assembly. Principal Hawkins had insisted on holding it, despite Frank's protests. Frank lingered near the back, his arms crossed, trying to stay out of sight. But when Mia spotted him, she marched straight over and grabbed his arm. "You're not hiding," she said firmly, pulling him toward the stage. "I'm fine back here," Frank protested. "No, you're not," Mia replied, refusing to let go. "This is your moment, whether you like it or not." When the principal stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. He cleared his throat, glancing at Frank, who stood off to the side. "Today, we're here to recognize someone who's shown incredible courage and selflessness," Hawkins began. "Frank Sullivan has been a part of our school for years, quietly working behind the scenes. But yesterday, and many times before, he showed us that he's so much more than that." The crowd erupted into applause, but Frank's face remained unreadable. Hawkins continued. "What many of you may not know is that Frank was once a firefighter, a hero long before he joined us here. He saved countless lives, both in his past career and now at our school. His bravery is an example to us all." The principal motioned for Frank to step forward. The crowd cheered as Frank slowly approached the podium. When he reached the microphone, Frank hesitated, his hands gripping the edges of the stand. The room quieted, waiting for him to speak. "I don't know what to say," Frank began, his voice steady but quiet. "I'm not used to being the center of attention. I've spent a long time trying to stay out of it." He looked at the crowd, his eyes landing on Mia, who smiled encouragingly. "I've made mistakes," Frank continued. "I've carried guilt for things I couldn't control. But yesterday reminded me of something important. We all have a choice to step up when we're needed, no matter how scared or broken we feel. I'm grateful to be here, and I'm grateful for all of you." The room erupted into applause again, louder this time. Mia stood up, clapping with all her might. Even Chad and Trevor joined in, their faces red with a mix of admiration and embarrassment. When the assembly ended, Frank stayed behind as students and teachers filed out. Harper approached him, clapping him on the shoulder. "Not bad, Sullivan," Harper said with a grin. Frank shook his head but smiled faintly. "I'm not much for speeches." "You did fine," Harper replied. "Maybe it's time you stop hiding and start living again." Frank looked around the empty auditorium, the weight in his chest feeling lighter than it had in years. "Maybe," he said. When Frank returned to work, something had shifted. The students greeted him with smiles instead of snide remarks. Chad and Trevor even stopped by to help him with a spill in the cafeteria, their apologies awkward but genuine. Mia, as always, stuck close, her curiosity replaced by admiration. "So, what's next?" she asked one day, as Frank repaired a broken bench in the courtyard. Frank looked up at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Next? I keep doing what I've always done, helping where I can. But maybe now I'll stop beating myself up along the way." Mia grinned. "Good, because this school needs you." Frank nodded, his gaze shifting to the mural students were painting on the wall, an image of him holding a fire extinguisher surrounded by flames with the words, "A true hero." For the first time in years, Frank felt at peace. Months later, a new plaque was installed in the school hallway beneath the mural. It read, "To Frank Sullivan, whose quiet strength and courage remind us all that true heroes don't seek recognition. They simply act." Frank passed it every day on his way to work, and every day he smiled, because now, finally, he believed it. If you were inspired by Frank Sullivan's story of resilience and bravery, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video to remind others that true heroes can come from the most unexpected places. Tell us what you think in the comments. What would you have done in Frank's shoes? And don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories that show how everyday actions can make an extraordinary difference. Together, let's celebrate the quiet heroes in our lives.